Welcome into press coverage. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Chase Brown and Andy Anders on a huge day for Ohio State recruiting as the Buckeyes have now completed their 2026 recruiting class, and doing so with the biggest piece of that class, as we have spent the past 48 hours wondering what Chris Henry Jr. was going to do. We went into Wednesday, National Signing Day, thinking he was going to sign with the Buckeyes. Then the news drops that Brian Hartline is going to be the new head coach at South Florida. After that happens, Chris Henry Jr. decides, I need to take a step back, weigh my options. Go back to yesterday, Thursday, the rumors were he's going to flip to Oregon. Like, that's what a lot of national recruiting insiders were saying. There were even reports that Ohio State was out of it. And then today, the news comes out, Chris Henry Jr. is going to make his announcement on the Pat McAfee show, and everything flips back to Ohio State. He goes on the show, says he is staying committed to Ohio State, that Ohio State was the place he felt most comfortable and the place that he has been dreaming of playing for years. This is someone who has been committed to Ohio State since the summer of 2023, and now it is finally official. He will be a Buckeye, and certainly a big important win for Ohio State on the recruiting trail, because Chris Henry Jr., the number one ranked wide receiver in the 2026 class, someone who Ohio State identified, he was offered before he'd even started his freshman year of high school. I mean, I remember seeing him at camp back in 2022, and you could see it even then. This guy's a future five-star. This guy could be, the next Marvin Harrison Jr. kind of player at Ohio State. And now we're going to see if that actually comes to fruition. Andy, I know you've seen him out there at camps as well. You've been following his entire high school career, just like me. What kind of impact do you envision Chris Henry Jr. having for the Buckeyes?
Yeah, this is a guy who can step in and get in the receiver rotation day one. I mean, there's some competition, of course, at the top of Ohio State's receiver room. Certainly next year you're going to bring back Jeremiah Smith. You're going to bring back Brandon Ennis, ideally. But even if it's not as a starter, I think he's going to be the type of prospect that's too good not to at least give some reps in his first season. And by the time you hit year two, I do think this is a guy, such a complete game, tall. I mean, the length is unreal. The athletic traits are unreal. The refinement, the polish of the game already, with route running, with high points, with a lot of the finer points of playing receiver. He's just such a complete package in a way that I just think he's a can't miss prospect. Like, going to be All-American someday, going to be a first-round NFL draft pick, all the things. It's just a massive land and a massive way to close this out for Ohio State. After you lose Brian Hartline to South Florida, you're still able to hold on to this guy. And I think it really is a signifier to everyone out there who maybe is feeling a little bit panicked about the Brian Hartline news, or maybe has a little bit of doubt about the future. We said it before, Ohio State's going to be fine, and Ohio State's already still doing great without Brian Hartline in its room.
Personally, I will not be surprised at all if Chris Henry Jr. is a starter in year one. And I don't usually say that about freshmen coming in, but you look at how this year has gone. I think we certainly all expect Carnell Tate is going to be playing in the NFL next year. We expect Brandon Ennis will be back as that slot receiver, but the backup receiver performance production hasn't been where you would want to see it be. And I do think Chris Henry Jr. is special. I'm not saying that I think he's Jeremiah Smith, because I think Jeremiah Smith is one of one. I think comparing anyone to Jeremiah Smith and expecting him to come in and be Jeremiah Smith on day one is setting the bar too high, because Jeremiah Smith is unique and special. But I do think that Chris Henry Jr. has the talent, especially as someone coming in and early enrolling a month from now, that I think he's going to be very much in that mix for that starting spot. Quincy Porter's going to be in that mix as well. Mylan Graham's going to be in that mix as well. But, we don't know the exact dollars and cents, but we do know that Ohio State is giving Chris Henry Jr. Significant money to come to Ohio State. Oregon tried to make a big push to flip him. Texas tried to make a big push to flip him. There's a lot of money involved there. Chris Henry Jr. ultimately saying on the Pat McAfee show, his ultimate decision was made based on comfort level with the school. not with money. And we know Ohio State, they don't like getting into straight bidding wars. So for Chris Henry Jr. to become a Buckeye, he was going to have to say, this is the place I really want to be. And to your point, Andy, I think that this is a big signifier that, yeah, Brian Hartline's gone, but Ohio State's not going anywhere. Yes, recruiting wide receivers is going to be a little bit harder without Brian Hartline, but at the end of the day, there were 3 wide receivers who really kind of hung in the balance with Brian Hartline leaving. One of them ultimately left. Caden Dixon-Wyatt flips to USC. Jaquaden Guilford stays on at Ohio State. Chris Henry Jr. stays on at Ohio State. And so the wide receiver room is still going to be well stocked with talent next year. I mean, who knows? They might even look in the portal too. I think that was probably more likely when it looked like Chris Henry Jr. wasn't going to go to Ohio State, but it is now. I think with Henry coming in, if you assume that Quincy Porter, Mylan Graham, guys like that, Phillip Bell, guys will kind of make those next steps in their development next year. They shouldn't need a transfer portal wide receiver. It doesn't necessarily mean that Ohio State won't bring one in, because I think part of the reason they didn't was Brian Hartline kind of said, I don't really want to bring transfers into my room. That could all change with whoever the next wide receivers coach is. But Chase, from my vantage point, you see a signing like this today, you see the talent that's in that room. And even though Brian Hartline won't be at Ohio State, I don't think wide receiver U is going anywhere.
No, I don't think so. And, this signing comes as a bit of a surprise considering all the things that happened with Oregon. There was even, talk that Texas had come in with a significant offer to land him. In the graphic that Hayes Fawcett posted, he also had USC and LSU in the mix as potentially being schools that could land Henry. But his decision to stick with Ohio State, I do think, is going to pay dividends for this program for a long time. And this is a kid that I think it started with a surprise, his recruitment. I remember a couple of years ago, Dan, you and Garrick were at, it was like a recruit fest at the Woody Hayes Athletic Center.
They called it.
Chris Henry comes outside of the Woody and says, yeah, I just committed. And Garrick shoots me a message and says, hey, we don't have anything prepped on this. Nobody did. Nobody knew that he was going to commit. He commits then in July 2023. It
looked like his interview was about to be over, and then Pac-Man Jones was like standing over in the corner, and he's like, tell him the news. It was like he hadn't said anything. Like Pac-Man Jones basically told him to reveal the news that he had committed to Ohio State.
Yeah, and he then, remains committed for a couple of years. He shut down his recruitment in April and then ultimately says on the Pat McAfee show that he's going to sign. And that kind of saga, that kind of commitment that Ohio State was able to remain engaged with the recruit for a couple of years is also something that's significant as well, because that's not just Brian Hartline who's keeping in touch with Chris Henry Jr. that entire time. There's people that are a part of Ohio State's recruiting staff that have an excellent relationship with him. There are recruits that are coming into this 2026 class alongside him that have great relationships. And I think that that's partially what Ryan Day was probably selling to Chris Henry when he was trying to retain him in his recruitment. There's also this factor that Ohio State recruits quarterbacks better than anybody in the country. They land top quarterbacks in their class year after year. And to be able to sell that to receivers as well is something that has to be an attractive point for Ohio State's program. And they're coming off of a national championship season in 2024. They're the favorite to win a national championship in 2025. You can start selling hardware as well. You walk into that Woody Hayes Athletic Center right outside of where Chris Henry did that interview a couple of years ago. There's a trophy room that has dozens of trophies that include national championships, Heisman trophies, Biletnikoffs, all that kind of stuff that you can sell to these receivers coming into the program. And it goes back to what Ryan Day had said in his press conference on Wednesday as well, kind of referring to Brian Hartline's departure, that Ohio State is bigger than just one person. That was something that Jim Tressel and Urban Meyer told him. So Ohio State is going to be able to withstand Brian Hartline's departure. Of course, there will be ramifications, but I do think that this is a significant move when it comes to ensuring the future of Ohio State's wide receiver room.
I think everything you just said really speaks to the stability of Ohio State right now. And I think, the way that this recruiting class finished up really speaks to Ohio State's stability, because, the last few years, the storyline kind of at this time of year going into signing day had been about the guys who didn't sign with Ohio State. There were a lot of guys flipping out at the last moment, Ohio State losing battles that came down to the wire. This year was very much the opposite of that, where Ohio State flipped a lot of guys this fall. Signing day, there were only 2 guys who were committed coming into signing day that didn't sign. One of them was Caden Dixon-Wyatt. The other one, Legend Bey. That's a crazy story. And I mean, Legend Bey might end up back at Ohio State. I mean, we'll see what happens with that story. We wrote about it yesterday, the crazy story of how he flipped to Tennessee, but based on what has been reported and even tweets from his own account that were quickly deleted, it doesn't sound like he wanted to sign with Tennessee. It sounded like he wanted to sign with Ohio State, that pressure from family members ultimately led to him signing with Tennessee, but he will turn 18 later this month and could potentially seek his release from Tennessee. If so, it would stand to reason that he could potentially end up at Ohio State. So I did say at the top of the show, the class is complete. Maybe not quite complete yet. Maybe the possibility of still getting a 28th guy later. But right now it stands at 27. And I personally, I think this is a really good class. I think getting Chris Henry Jr. was important because I think without Chris Henry Jr., the headline that a lot of people would have focused on, particularly probably fans of other schools that are perhaps eager to see Ohio State lose its perch atop college football, would have pointed out that without Chris Henry Jr., Ohio State would not have had a composite 5-star in this class. And so compared to some classes, there's maybe not quite as much star power in this class outside of Chris Henry Jr., but in my opinion, there's a lot of really quality prospects in this class. I think you can look across the board at every position. And I think there's players at every position in this class who have the potential to be really good players at Ohio State. I think, I think Chris Henry Jr. is certainly the surest thing. I think there's some other guys that are high 4-stars in this class that I'm very high on. I mean, Sincere Johnson, again, just like we shouldn't compare Chris Henry Jr. to Jeremiah Smith, we probably shouldn't compare anyone to Arvell Reese right now. But you just look at the physical makeup, the fact that he's coming from the same Glenville program, how productive he's been there, some of the physical tools that he has. It's easy for your mind to go there. Kari Wilder is a guy whose stock really soared in his senior year, finished as the number 42 overall prospect in the class. I think a guy who's, maybe not going to be that, 12 sacks a year kind of guy, but I think could be a really good defensive end for Ohio State, maybe in a similar mold to Kenyatta Jackson Jr. or Zach Harrison for the Buckeyes. I really like the game he brings to the table as a well-rounded defensive end. Sam Greer is a guy, in-state offensive tackle. I think he can be a future left tackle for the Buckeyes. I mean, he already looks like a grown man. He's 6'8", 315, great athlete. I'm very high on him. Blaine Bradford's a guy who was a 5-star at the time that he committed to Ohio State. Ohio State beating out LSU to take him out of Baton Rouge, even though his brother plays at LSU. So that was maybe the splashiest win for Ohio State in this class outside of Chris Henry Jr. And I think that he's someone who certainly has the potential to compete for early playing time in that safety room. Not saying he's going to be Caleb Downs next year, but I think that he's somebody within his first 2 years at Ohio State is going to have a very good chance of contending for a starting job there. I want to go down the line here. Who is a guy or two in this class who's maybe not as highly ranked, who you think is going to end up being a hidden gem for Ohio State in this class? And Andy, I'm going to start with you because I have a feeling you have a certain person in mind.
Yeah, I've talked about him quite a bit to Dan and Chase off air. I've even tweeted about him once or twice. I think Brock Boyd is a steal, man. I think he's only 600. He's 601st in the composite rankings, which is absurd to me. To me, I'm big on production, especially when you're playing elite high school competition, which he does. South Lake Carroll is a Texas powerhouse, and they got to the state championships last year. They're still on their playoff run this year. Brock Boyd had 1,875 receiving yards in one season at South Lake Carroll. He set a school record. And he's doing similar numbers again this year. When you're producing at those levels against that high of a bar of competition, I really think that shows you it can translate. And he's super explosive athlete. You're talking 4.4 speed, really shifty, runs great routes. he makes really good contested catches. There's a lot of that on his tape of him mossing guys. He's, to me, a lot of what you look for at the receiver position with the proven production. I really think this is a guy who, like, the fact that he's 600th in this class is crazy to me, given all those factors. So I'm really high on Brock Boyd, and I think that could be someone who gets a chance to contribute uh, by the end of his Ohio State career, especially maybe in the slot. I think he's got some skills that might fit him well into the slot for Ohio State. But yeah, and I'm starting the Brock Boyd Truthers Club if anyone wants to join.
Chase, who's a guy who jumps out to you?
Yeah, one quick thing I'll add, or I guess two quick things on Brock Boyd was we were at a press conference on Wednesday when Mark Pantoni called him probably the most underrated wide receiver. He might have even gone as far as saying the most underrated prospect in this class. And I think that's a significant mark for Mark Pantoni to come out and say that about him as a prospect.
So he is joining the Brock Boyd Truthers Club with Andy.
Exactly. He and Andy are the founding members of that club. A couple of guys I would pick, just because I'm a local guy. I grew up in Worthington. It's 15 minutes north of Ohio State's campus. I always think that because of that, I am always looking at local guys to be those who have that Buckeye pride. They grew up in Ohio State's backyard, and Ohio State actually has a few of those guys in this class, whether it's Favor Akey, the running back from Delaware, CJ Sana, he's a linebacker from Olentangy and Lewis Center. His teammate, Caden Gebhart, is also a safety that could potentially transition to a linebacker in this class. And then Jaden Ricketts playing from Watkins Memorial in Pataskala. And there are plenty of other guys that are from Ohio in this class. And I think that Ryan Day has done a great job of kind of blending those two, both a local and a statewide, but also mixing that with a national approach to his recruiting. And I think that that has maybe in some ways brought back an identity of Ohio pride that has helped solidify the culture that he's wanted to create here at Ohio State. That there is a group of guys in each class who have grown up dreaming about being a Buckeye, and those guys end up being the pace setters in the class that Ohio State establishes, bringing in those national guys and teaching them, hey, like, this is something that means more than any of us. There are over 11 million fans that are a part of this fan base that cheer on this team every weekend. We were one of them growing up, most likely, and we want to create something special here at Ohio State. So if it's any of those guys, I think you might see guys like CJ Sana, somebody that James Laurinaitis, I think, is really excited about. I do also think that Favor Akey is someone who is very obviously an Ohio State fan. He made so many visits to Ohio State over the course of his recruitment. Could he potentially be somebody that Carlos Laughlin transforms into a contributor for an Ohio State offense down the road? So there's definitely a lot to be excited about with those Ohio guys.
To your point, 11 players from Ohio in this 2026 class. You could even include Chris Henry Jr. because he was in Cincinnati for a couple years before he transferred out to Mater Dei High School out in California. So a significant Ohio presence in this class. And I agree with you. I mean, I think it is important to have guys from Ohio in the class. And I think part of it, too, is when you're filling out of class, if you're maybe taking a chance on a guy who's maybe a lower ranked developmental guy, it makes sense to do it with a guy who's from Ohio and loves the Buckeyes. Like Mason Wilhelm's the kind of guy I think we would all agree. Like, you take that guy. You know, this is he's a 3-star offensive lineman. He's ranked 1,002nd in the country. He's going to be a developmental prospect at Ohio State. But this is a guy, his dad was an All-American linebacker for the 2002 national championship team. This is a guy who, I mean, he loves the Buckeyes so much. He had been committed to North Carolina. He got a call on like a Thursday night and he committed to Ohio State on Friday morning. Like, this guy has lived and breathed, loved wanting to play for the Buckeyes his entire childhood. Those are the kind of guys you should take. Like, you should make room for guys like that in the class because, you know, Ryan Day talks about it all the time. We want guys who want to be Buckeyes. And I think that has stayed very true in this class. I think that's why you only see one 5-star because, you know, there were a few 5-star guys in this class that Ohio State would have loved to have, and, I think like a guy who really jumps to mind for me is Felix Ojo, a 5-star offensive tackle. There are a few guys like that Ohio State would have loved to have in this class, but ultimately their recruitments came down to straight up bidding wars. And I mean, Mark Pantoni said it, like, we are not going to overpay for recruits. Like, we are going to, Ohio State is certainly using its NIL money. And I think the fact that they ultimately landed Chris Henry Jr. after all this shows that Ohio State's NIL remains very strong, that Ohio State is more than capable of getting top talent. But they just don't want to get into straight bidding wars. Culture has been such an important factor of Ohio State's success dating back to last season and continuing through this season. And Ryan Day, I think, places a big premium on guys who fit the culture, not just who's the most physically gifted player in the class. You have to be very talented to play at Ohio State. There's no question about that. You have to be a really, really, really good football player to play at Ohio State. There's no question about that. But Ohio State also wants guys who fit the culture. And based on, I just look through the entire list, and I have not met all of these guys, but based on what I know about each of them, there's not one guy in the class that I'd look at and go like, I'm surprised Ohio State took that guy from a cultural fit. Like, everything you hear about pretty much all of these guys is like, they're good kids. They love football. Like, they all just seem to fit what Ohio State has been building for the last few years. So that's why I look at this class and say, yeah, maybe you'd like to have a couple more like real big fish 5-star at the top. But I think this is a good class. I think there's a lot of players in this class who are going to end up being good players for Ohio State. A couple more who jump to mind for me as guys who I think could be gems in this class. Not a real lower ranked guy, but a guy who I think is going to be a really good player is Jordan Thomas, the number 123 overall prospect, number 15 cornerback. Based on what, has been said, it sounded like he was very much Tim Walton's top prospect, the guy that he wanted the most at cornerback in his class. Obviously one of those guys who Ohio State would have liked to get, that there was some disappointment that Ohio State didn't get, was Albert Hill, the cornerback from Archbishop Hoban, who is the number 1 ranked prospect in the state of Ohio. That's one of those guys, like, you don't like missing out on a guy like that. But but you understand, he's like, Jordan Thomas is really the guy who Tim Walton wanted most in this class. And, coming from Bergen Catholic in New Jersey, Ohio State's had a lot of, like, New Jersey's just been a good state to Ohio State in recent years. There's been a lot of guys from New Jersey, whether it's Jalen McClain, Ronnie Hickman, Cody Simon, Luke Whippler. There's been a lot of guys, Davison Igbinosin coming through the transfer portal, but also a guy from New Jersey. Taiwan Malone, another guy from New Jersey. There's just been a lot of guys from New Jersey who maybe weren't like the highest ranked recruits in the world, but they've come to Ohio State and they've become really good football players. And Jordan Thomas is one of those guys. I think both on the field as a player and also the qualities that he has off the field is a guy who I can see being a future leader of the Ohio State secondary. And then a lower ranked guy who I'm certainly going to be keeping an eye on is Jameer Perez, another Glenville guy, because you just don't get a lot of 6'4", 360-pound nose tackles. And, a different position, but he kind of reminds me of DeJuan Jones, who came in as a lower ranked guy, but it's just like, look at this guy. Look at how huge he is. And you see the same thing, and you turn on Jameer Perez's film and like, man, this guy moves good for a 360-pound nose tackle. Now, they're probably going to want him to slim down a little bit at Ohio State. He's going to have to work on his conditioning. I think improving his technique is going to be an important thing for him, because you watch his high school film, a lot of times all he has to do is just straight bull rush guys, because not many high school offensive linemen can stop a guy who's 360 pounds. So there's going to be a couple years of development needed there, but you think about the future of Ohio State's defensive line. You think about the possibility of Caden McDonald being a guy who could be in the NFL draft next year. Jameer Perez is certainly a guy that I'm going to be watching as a developmental player at that nose tackle position, because you need those big guys in the middle of a defense. Andy can certainly attest of, just being able to just stuff the run up the middle. And I think that, I think he's a guy that if he develops the way Ohio State thinks he can develop, the potential is there for him to be a whole lot better than the 768th overall prospect in the 2026 class. Andy, I'll start with you. Any other closing thoughts that you have on this 2026 class?
Yeah, several. To me, I really like just the depth of this class overall. Like you mentioned, the fact that you've got like at least really quality prospects at pretty much every position group. Guys that, like you said, only with one 5-star, but you have a lot of guys that are top 200 guys that are going to fill out the depth of this class. I think as you go down, you mentioned Sam Greer earlier. I think Maxwell Riley's also going to be a really good player out of Avon Lake in Ohio. You have those two Ohio guys, top 200 offensive linemen, to bolster that. Those there in the trenches. Ryan Day talked about how much he loves this offensive line and this defensive line class when we spoke to him on signing day, how much of a priority it was to address the trenches and build up front because those positions are much harder to get in the transfer portal. We've seen it in recent years when Ohio State's wanted to go out and get an offensive tackle or an offensive lineman or a defensive lineman. It's been difficult to secure those players because they're at premiums when you're looking in the transfer portal. And I think Ohio State's approach to NIL is another thing that you touched on. I have some more thoughts on because I think as much as it's about like Ohio State doesn't want to get them bidding wars for guys, they kind of have their valuation, what they see a guy being worth, and they aren't going to move much from that number. I think it's also about resource allocation, right? Ohio State won a national championship in 2024 because it spent its money on roster retention and the transfer portal. So knowing that you can spend your NIL dollars there and not just throw it all into recruiting like some other programs are. Yes, recruiting is important. It's still the first place you want to build through as a program. Ryan Day has touched on that. But the ability to retain a guy for an extra year that might be borderline considering going to the NFL draft, the ability to address key needs in the transfer portal, that has been important for Ohio State in recent years. Part of why they've sustained a lot of the success they've had. And so for me, I think when you talk about NIL dollars, when you talk about those things, you sign a really good quality depth class like this, and then you have, if you need it, still resources to retain a guy, to go get a guy in the portal, all those types of things. Yeah, I really like this defensive line class too with Damari Simeon and Emmanuel Ruffin. Ruffin was a really good flip, I think, from Colorado. That's going to be a really good player. You add another big body there, 6'4", 295. Like you talked about Javier Perez earlier. There's a lot of size and good quality star power, even with the pair of 4 stars on at defensive tackle for Ohio State in this class. And I think, like in the past, that's been an issue Ohio State's need to address. We've maybe felt in the past that depth at that nose guard position, or even like just on the defensive interior in general, was maybe lacking. This year, maybe that narrative wasn't as true. Will Smith Jr. stepped up. Tywan Malone Jr. stepped up for Ohio State. But this is just a great class to build on that defensive tackle depth. I really like some of the, like, again, borderline top 200 guys they added there. So overall, I think this is a class that is not going to jump out at you and grab you with those 5-star guys, but you just have a really well-rounded depth of quality 4-star talent that is going to fill the ranks and be the building blocks, the pieces you need to lay the foundations of a really good roster in the future.
Chase, any closing thoughts?
The only thing I would add is I think Ohio State fans should be extremely encouraged by how Ohio State closed this class, not only in the past couple of days during the signing period, but during the season as well. It reminded me, and I'm sure you guys as well, a lot of when Nick Saban was closing out his classes at Alabama, where these recruits were committed elsewhere and Ohio State's able to come in at the end and say, are you sure that check's going to clear? Are you sure that this team is going to lead you to getting some hardware? Like, we're on the precipice of getting gold pants, Big Ten championships, national championships. every year, and we want you to be a part of this class. We want you to be a Buckeye. And I think that was something that Nick Saban did extremely well. Was there was always these last hour, the 11th hour moments where Ohio State's in on a recruit, and then Nick Saban swoops in and shows them the collection of rings that he has and says, hey, come play for the Alabama Crimson Tide. I think that Ryan Day is trending in the direction now where, let's say, even since 2000, how many schools have actually won multiple national championships? You have Alabama, you have LSU, you have Florida, you have Clemson, you have Georgia. I believe that's the extent of the list. There's been a few schools that have played for more, but of all those schools that I just named, which school would you take as the one that's trending in the best direction right now? It's probably of those three going to be Ohio State, Georgia, and Alabama. So you're going to see those schools swooping in toward the end, trying to pick up these recruits. And I think that Ryan Day is able to maximize his standing right now as the hottest coach in college football, using that tool to gain leverage over recruits and over different programs to get classes assembled at the last minute. And so I think that's something that he started to do this year, maybe started to show that he can do, and something that he'll probably look to build on in the future.
And I think a point that goes along with that too, that we really saw this year, is that Ohio State is really evaluating prospects during their senior year too. And that's not something that necessarily every school does to the extent that Ohio State does it. That they are really continuing to do the work, Mark Pantoni and his staff behind the scenes, of watching for guys who improve in their senior year and getting into those races late. I think probably the best example of that would be Braxton Rembert. He's a guy who, I think when Ohio State offered him, he was ranked like 1400th in the country or something. He was committed to Wake Forest. That was his only Power 4 offer. Now he's signed with Ohio State. He's ranked 358th in the country because he had a really, really good senior year. Ohio State recognized that and identified him as, hey, we need another linebacker in our class. This is the guy. We want to be that guy. And, Ohio State, the thing about these classes is like classes tend to get rated based on how they're ranked by a few recruiting sites. And that's not a knock on recruiting sites or anything, but it's just a reality of like, that tends to be how we grade classes. And then you see a guy like Braxton Rembert, his ranking changed by 1,000 spots. And it's like, oh, the narrative of this signing just completely changed. It's like, Ohio State's taking a shot on this like hidden gem to like, oh, Ohio State just got a 4-star linebacker. So, I think the important thing is, Kamari Bing's another guy. He was ranked low. Now he's ranked in the top 400. I mean, Tucker Smith's a guy who was not highly ranked when they took his commitment. I think what it shows you is Ohio State is doing the work. They're not just relying on, oh, this guy's a composite 4-star, 5-star, whatever, and offering guys. They're doing the work, the evaluations themselves to find guys who they think are Ohio State caliber player. And some of these guys, you sign 27 guys, the expectation is you sign 27 guys in a class, like you're hoping like if 10 or 12 of them become really good players, that's a great class. Like some guys are going to work out, some guys aren't. But I think as Andy mentioned, the depth in this class, especially in the trenches, I think Ohio State, they're taking enough bites at the apple to where it's like, not everybody in this class is going to become a star, but you feel good about the depth that Ohio State's assembled in this class to where you think there's going to be enough players in this class who end up being really good to keep a really good thing going right now for Ohio State, because I think we'd all agree that, as we head into conference championship weekend, Ohio State 12-0, 16 straight wins dating back to last year's college football playoff. There's not a program in college football that's sitting in a better spot as we sit here right now. With that, we're going to have a lot more time to talk about this recruiting class in the offseason. We got to shift our focus back to the current team because there is a 1 versus 2 matchup tomorrow, guys. Ohio State, the number 1 team in the country, facing Indiana, the number 2 team in the country. A battle of college football's last 2 unbeaten teams this year for the Big Ten championship and the number 1 seed in the college football playoffs. So this is probably going to be our last video before tomorrow's Big Ten championship game. So while we've been focused on recruiting here, as a bonus, I'm going to go down the line. I'll start with you, Chase. Prediction for tomorrow's game.
Yeah, I got Ohio State 30, Indiana 17 in this game. As I've shared with you guys and maybe even shared on my Skull session, I can't remember. This week's been such a blur. But there's 3 reasons why I'm picking Ohio State. I think the talent is obvious in Ohio State's favor. Ohio State's the number 3 team in the 24/7 sports talent composite. Indiana is 72nd. Kurt Signetti and his staff have done a tremendous job to take that roster and make it the number 2 team in the country. But when you talk about talent, you also have to talk about depth, which would be my second thing. And I think Ohio State has the depth with its roster and the experience with that depth, where if there's ever a player that gets tired, hey, sub out that 5-star, bring in another 5 or 4-star to face this Indiana team. The third thing, I think this is something that Ryan Day has subtly been hinting at throughout the week, and it's the fact that this game is indoors in a dome on a fast track. And I think that we're going to see an Ohio State team the fastest that it has looked all season long. Jeremiah Smith's getting healthy. Carnell Tate's getting healthy. Ryan Day had said earlier this week that they look better now than they did a week ago at this point, and they looked pretty dang good in Ann Arbor when the weather was not in their favor. So I think having those guys available on a fast track, Bo Jackson as well, this defense flying around, I just think it might be a little bit too much for Indiana to handle. And I think Ohio State so closely keeps hold of that pace that they're on and in trend with that record that they might be pushing toward of keeping opponents under 17 points. I'll put them right on that edge for Indiana.
Andy?
Yeah, I have it closer than I think some of our staff does, and I guess we all, when I put together our score predictions every week behind the scenes. Everyone picked an Ohio State cover that's on staff, on 11 Warriors staff. All 12 of us picked an Ohio State cover. Spread is down to 4 points, I believe, still. So to me, I see it closer than I see this as a one-score game. Because I think these are clearly the 2 best teams in college football. I think it's the best offense Ohio State's played. I think it's the best defense Ohio State's played when you talk about Indiana. And maybe Texas holds an argument on the defensive side, but I like Indiana's, honestly, just going off the numbers, going off what they've done this year. I think Indiana's even better on the defensive side of the ball when you look at what they have up front. 3rd in the nation in tackles for loss as a team with 103 of them. They get great penetration. They have each of their starters up front on defense is really good quality caliber guy. Stephen Daly, I think especially stands out as someone who had 18 tackles for loss in the regular season, which led the nation. But a lot more to that Indiana defensive front than just him, of course. Aiden Fisher back at linebacker, like they got all Big Ten guys everywhere, like Ohio State does. I've talked about boiling point games in the past where I think like a team can play really well and all season, but they run into a team that's just kind of more talented across the board. And Ohio State has had these types of matchups in the past where they just get overwhelmed. I don't see that happening. I see this as a tight battle with a lot on the line for both programs, believe it or not, because Ohio State wants its first Big Ten title in 5 years. Indiana wants to continue proving itself on the national stage and stay undefeated. And the Heisman, too. Like, there's a really good chance this game decides the Heisman Trophy. So I think Ohio State 27-20 is the score I have. Indiana scores the most points that anyone scored against Ohio State because it is the best offense they've played, even though Ohio State's defense is like generationally good, right? I've said that many times. I think Indiana has the playmakers to just do some really exceptional things on the offensive end and generate some offense that way. I think, though, the Ohio State offense, the way it's been executing lately, especially since the run game got going against Michigan, and Jeremiah Smith, Carnell Tate having another week to get even healthier than they were in Ann Arbor last weekend. I think Ohio State just finds one extra drive where it's methodical and efficient and gets that one extra score and wins this game by a touchdown.
Want to give a shout out to our sponsor, First Bank of Central Ohio, the official bank of 11 Warriors. From game day to workday, First Bank of Central Ohio is proud to support the business owners that keep Central Ohio thriving. They are locally owned, business focused, and always in your corner. Give them a visit at fbcentralohio.com. And as for my prediction, I'm going to go Ohio State 31, Indiana 20. I believe this will be the toughest test Ohio State has faced all year, particularly in terms of what Indiana will present on the offensive side of a ball. I don't think that Ohio State has faced a quarterback as good as Fernando Mendoza this year. I don't think they've faced receivers as good as Omar Cooper Jr. and Elijah Surratt this year. Indiana also has a really good run game. And so this is going to be a big test for Ohio State, especially on defense. I do think this will be the first time an opponent scores more than 17 points against the Buckeyes this year. But you mentioned the Heisman. I think we are going to see a Heisman caliber performance from Julian Sayin on Saturday night to lead the Buckeyes to a victory in Indianapolis for their first Big Ten championship in 5 years. But it's going to be a great game to watch. All three of us will be there in Indianapolis tomorrow night to cover the Big Ten championship game. So lots more coverage to come on 11warriors.com. It's been a busy week already, but it's not going to slow down this weekend as the Big Ten championship game comes tomorrow night. And then on Sunday, the college football playoff field will be revealed. So we'll be covering all of that for you over on 11warriors.com. We hope you stay tuned with us over there. For now, he's Chase Brown. He's Andy Anders. I'm Dan Hope. We'll catch you next time.